Our next talk is a Beta-Variational Auto-Encoder model of human visual representation formation and utility-based learning, presented by Tyler Malloy.
Thank you. Hi, so that's the title, and it's very long. Yeah, so one broad question that motivates this research is the following. So how do humans learn to efficiently represent task-relevant visual information? And in this talk, I'll describe one potential model and apply it onto predicting human behavior in a visual learning task. So the model that I will describe is based on a Beta-Variational Auto-Encoder, which has the following structure. The model is a deep neural network that takes as input some visual information, which is then fed through layers of convolutions as well as fully connected layers to form a lower dimensional latent representation that is more informationally simplistic. And this latent representation takes the form of a vector of means and standard deviations that define a multivariate Gaussian distribution. This distribution can be sampled from and then fed back through the decoder layers of the network to reconstruct the original stimuli, and the entire model is trained such that the reconstruction is as accurate as possible, as close to the original stimuli as possible. So a recent study by Higgins et al. In 2021 found that the activity of neurons within the primate face area while viewing images of human faces demonstrated a similar correspondence to the behavior of these latent representations trained to reconstruct images of human faces. And specifically, they both demonstrate this so-called disentanglement objective. And this refers to the idea that changing the stimuli along a single dimension, such as changing the age of the human alone or the gender or different features, results in changing activity of a single neuron in the primate face area, as well as a change in the distribution of just one latent representation. So that refers to the disentanglement objective. And this objective is encouraged in Beta-Variational Auto-Encoders with a loss function that balances the accuracy of the reconstruction as well as the informational complexity of those latent representations. And it's weighted by a beta value that gives the model its name. So this approach to modeling human representation formation in mind, we can begin to ask more specific questions such as how does changing utility impact the learned visual representations of humans? And to answer this, we applied a version of the Beta-VAE model onto predicting data from human participants performing the following task, which was provided and collected by the Neuroscience group. And in this task, participants learned which single feature from 3 shapes, colors, or textures meant that the option corresponding to it was indicative of a higher utility. So participants made a selection of 3 options available to them, and they observed a reward of either 0 or 1. And there was a higher probability of observing a reward if they selected the option containing the feature of interest. And so trial blocks consisted of roughly between 20 and 25 trials, where the feature of interest was the same. So for instance, if the feature of interest is red, then the left option in the top example will give you the highest probability of observing a reward, and the middle one in the bottom one. And all stimuli pairs, so all options, contained all 9 features of interest. So there was always a blue square, a blue shape, a red shape, and so on for all the 9 features. So if we were to directly apply the Beta-VAE model onto this task, it would not provide estimates of the utility of the stimuli that are needed to predict participant behavior in this task. And additionally, it would represent the visual information in the same way on early blocks of the trial when the utility of shapes is unknown, as on later blocks when there's a change in the utility of the stimuli. And so to address this, we made a very slight adjustment to the structure and training of the Beta-VAE model to additionally predict the utility associated with that stimuli. So this does turn the model from strictly unsupervised to a sort of semi-supervised model. However, it's possible to pre-train these models with a sort of baseline utility so that they can get at some base level of performance of reconstructing these before you actually predict which behavior, the behavior of participants in that task. And so this required an updated model training method by adding a weighted value of the utility error. So this is the error of the prediction and the true ground truth utility, and it's weighted by a similar weighted term as the information complexity. And so this requires a source of utility ground truths to compare for this error calculation, which for the results that I'll show later is just the best performing reinforcement learning algorithm from the original Nivedal paper. But the original Nivedal paper, that reinforcement learning algorithm is based on sort of handcrafted features as the category of the shapes instead of the visual information of the actual stimuli. And so to compare our proposed model against related methods, we use a similarly structured convolutional neural network that was trained to output the category of the stimuli, as well as the same utility outputs and the same utility weighted method. And additionally, we included a sparse version of this CNN that was trained with both dropout, as well as a smaller final fully connected layer that's the input to the utility prediction submodule. And that's just to mimic the information bottleneck property of the Beta-VAE model. And additionally, just for the sake of comparison, I'll also show the baseline FRL model from the original paper. Yeah, again, these predictions are based on handcrafted features, not the visual information. So that's sort of an upper bound on the accuracy of these predictions because it's being used to train all the deep neural network models. And so here we compare the predictive accuracy of the 3 deep neural network models as well as that baseline FRL model, which provides those utility predictions. And so predictive accuracy is the % probability that the model assigns to the selection that was actually made by the human participant during the learning task. And as you can see, our proposed Beta-VAE model outperforms the similarly structured CNN and sparse CNN models, indicating that the disentanglement objective used to train Beta-VAEs may be a good strategy for visual utility-based learning tasks. And so good predictive accuracy is obviously nice and it's important to any model. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm interested in how these changing utilities impact the learned visual representations. And so in order to get a better idea of what I mean by that, let's look at a simpler one-dimension representation space. So here we have our stimuli space that only has 3 different colors. It's varying along 1 dimension, and they all have an initial utility of 0. And so after pre-training the Beta-VAE, we can get these latent representations and just graph their distributions. And we can do this for all the different colors in order to form this sort of representation space that goes alongside the stimuli space. And so we have these 3 stimuli that are represented in this way, and they all have an initial utility of 0. And one important thing to, I guess, point out is this red overlapping area indicates the probability that a green stimuli would be mistaken for orange and vice versa when being reconstructed. However, however, as the orange utility, the orange stimuli increases in utility, a rational agent begins to prefer a representation strategy that has lower overlap of the orange distribution among the other 2, because there's a higher cost of confusing an orange stimuli for a blue or green. And finally, as the utility of the orange stimuli increases further, it must be represented completely separately from the blue and green distributions to avoid any possibility of confusion. So this more partitioned set of distributions on the right there does have a higher informational complexity. However, because our training method balances accuracy, simplicity, and these utility predictions, it's a possible result of our model training approach. And one thing to note here is that this red area on the right-hand side has increased in size, meaning that the probability of mistaking a blue and green stimuli for each other has increased. This is an example of acquired equivalence where 2 different stimuli can be represented more similarly as a result of similar experience with those stimuli. And so while it's difficult to test exactly whether this type of utility-based acquired equivalence did take place in the human participants engaged with the task I previously described, there is some analysis that can support it. And so here, this is that analysis. And the way that this was done was to compare how the representation overlap changes as the utility is learned by the model while it predicts human participant behavior. So here we're grouping together stimuli based on their true utility and comparing the average overlap of that representation distribution with either the same utility stimuli shown in orange or dissimilar utility stimuli shown in blue. And when we compare the representation overlap in this way, we can see the expected effect as the difference in utility is learned by both the human participant engaged in the task as well as the model that's predicting their performance. The utility with a similar, the stimuli with a similar utility remains relatively high in the representational overlap because there's a lower cost of confusing them compared to utility stimuli with dissimilar utility. And this is because stimuli with similar utility have that lower cost of confusion, meaning that they're allowed to be closer together in representation space, whereas stimuli of different utility need to be further apart in representation space to avoid any possibility of confusion. And so these results demonstrate that the disentanglement objective for representation formation may help to shed light on how utility-based visual representations are formed. They additionally provide evidence for a source of acquired equivalence of task-relevant stimuli in visual learning based on that similarity of their utility. And to further support the existence of this acquired equivalence of visual stimuli, I'm currently working on an experiment that adds a change detection task to those utility predictions to see whether or not humans actually are representing stimuli similarly based on their utility. And with that, there's some references as well as acknowledgements, and I have time for some questions.
Well, I have a question. I was just, when you were doing the disentanglement and thinking about the way it's sort of reminded me of all the like natural image statistics, like learning sparse codes, like David Olshausen and Field kind of things. I was wondering if you think that this is like a version of that that's more adaptive to the task, or if you think they're unrelated ideas, or how that connects to these sets of ideas.
I do think that they're definitely related. I was sort of hoping that the sparse CNN might demonstrate a little bit better performance, because I think there is some of the like explainability in this improved performance is coming from the fact that it's like these informationally simplistic representations. I think that if you did a lot of optimization, like for the dropout that I did, and you could probably optimize it a little bit better and probably get some like closer performance. But it is hard to say exactly and like how that impacts the representations. It is hard to definitely say, but it's interesting for sure. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks.